This is Let's Talk Energy, your go-to podcast for smart energy insights. I'm your host, Noah Brenner, and each week we're bringing you an inside look at the dynamics shaping global energy markets through in-depth conversations with our own Rystad energy experts, as well as some special guests. In today's episode, we're straddling hemispheres to get a perspective on what many are saying could be a historic COP climate gathering in Brazil, and taking a deep dive on one of the most interesting areas of discussion there, carbon markets. COP30 kicked off in Belém, in Brazil's Amazon, on November 10th. The meeting will see nations update their pledges for emissions reductions amidst a groundswell of so-called climate pragmatism that has seen business leaders and politicians shift their attention from aggressive emissions reduction to goals like energy security and affordability, as well as community development. And in case anyone has forgotten, President Trump has again pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, meaning there is no official delegation from the U.S. federal government, though there will be plenty of other U.S. politicians as well as business leaders in attendance. One important area in the discussion will be how to develop markets for nature-based solutions and other carbon credits. So these are things like preserving existing forests or mangrove swamps, as well as planting new ones, which proponents say can limit emissions more quickly and at lower cost than, say, putting your own carbon capture on a facility. Brazil, in particular, alongside other countries with tropical forests, are already playing a huge role in these markets. In just a bit, we'll be joined from Oslo by Petter Aspestrand, a senior analyst and a carbon markets expert with Rystad Energy, to talk through how carbon markets have developed over the past year and how this could further change at COP30. But first, I want to go to Houston, where Jeff Dickerson, a principal in Rystad Energy's advisory business, is packing his bags to head to Belém. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Noah. It's good to be here.
Let's talk energy. So, as I said, you're heading down to COP in just a few days. Is this your first one? What do you expect to be doing down there?
Well, aside from taking in the sights in beautiful Belém, Brazil, which, as you may know, is located at the mouth of the Amazon, I'll be participating in some discussion panels, meeting with delegates, and just generally exchanging perspectives on energy and climate. And maybe as a reminder for listeners who may not be familiar, COP stands for Conference of the Parties. And it's the annual meeting of the 198 countries, plus the European Union, which have signed and ratified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as the UNFCCC, which is the main international treaty aimed at addressing climate change. So the COP is the supreme decision-making body of the UNFCCC, where parties review progress, negotiate, and adopt decisions that guide global climate action. Listeners may be wondering, why is this COP30? Why not COP25? Well, the first meeting was held in 1995, making this the 30th COP, hence COP30. Each COP is presided over by a different host country, shaping the agenda and priorities for that year's conference. For COP30, that's Brazil.
COPs are often known as having a couple of key themes. Countries try to come up with an agenda where they think they can make progress. Where is it that we should be watching for at COP30 in terms of areas for focus that have been set by host country Brazil?
So this year, implementation is the name of the game. The key focus areas for COP30 in Belém revolve around advancing pragmatic, action-driven climate solutions aligned with the Belém Action Mechanism, a proposed institutional framework that's designed to accelerate a fast, fair, and financed global transition away from fossil fuels and to operationalize climate justice priorities. COP30 seeks a balance between ambition and pragmatism, really aiming to avoid past cycles of unfulfilled high-level pledges. Instead, it prioritizes credible, measurable delivery and increased funding over symbolic gestures to build trust and rapidly accelerate climate action worldwide. So some of the key themes are implementation of existing commitments, scaling climate finance, just transitions, adaptation and resilience, and nature-based solutions. And these reflect a shift from primarily political negotiations to really operationalizing climate promises with measurable impact in mind. Observers like myself are watching COP30 closely for real progress on these themes of financing, just transition, and operational NDCs, those being the nationally determined contributions which each country makes. And then adaptation, nature-based solutions, all these core themes are really defining this pivotal moment in global climate diplomacy.
Well, you mentioned those NDCs. Countries are due to update those. These are essentially the goals that countries say that they will try to achieve when it comes to emissions reduction. And if I'm understanding you correctly, this is a COP that's maybe less about discussing what it is that we should do and more about discussing how it is that we actually do it.
Exactly.
One of the major headlines here is the lack of participation by the US federal government. President Trump has obviously pulled the country out of the Paris Accord and is not sending anyone to the event. Though we do obviously have others from the US, like yourselves, who's going down, and other US politicians. We've seen Democratic, probably presidential hopeful Gavin Newsom there, and certainly taking advantage of the lack of US federal presence. So, how do you see this impacting the discussions? The U.S. federal government not being there, what does that mean for the discussion?
This is a big challenge, and I think there's a perception which is founded over time that the United States is often seen globally as an unreliable partner in UN climate initiatives. And this is based on a pattern of high profile policy reversals, non ratification of agreements, and withdrawals associated with shifting domestic political priorities and administrations. Similar to what you mentioned, you have the executive branch pulling out, but also different states, particularly on the opposite side of the political spectrum, sending high level delegates. This sort of pattern of unreliability dates back decades. If you think about the U.S. role in negotiating the Kyoto Protocol in 1995, but then withdrawing in 2001, U.S. helping shape the Paris Agreement in 2015, and then withdrawing in 2017, rejoining the same day President Biden was inaugurated in 2021, and then withdrawing again after Trump's inauguration in January of this year. And then even the recent rejection of proposed net zero frameworks at the IMO. The U.S. is seen as both a key leader in this space and then also one of the more challenging participants. But really, the mood at COP30 is much less focused on the U.S. There's much greater optimism around collaboration and self-actualization by the member states, and this goes in line with the implementation theme. So there's widespread acknowledgement that decarbonization pathways are no longer expensive initiatives requiring, extensive financial support from so-called rich nations to be achieved. Rather, as clean energy costs have continued to decline dramatically, they're seen as a cost-effective pathway to improve energy access and support economic growth. So this is a big shift in the economics has contributed to more focus on independent actions, hence, again, the implementation theme being so critical today.
You brought up something that I wanted to follow up on, which is the IMO. And, we essentially saw the Trump administration torpedo an agreement that had been hammered out among many nations. Now, who knows if it would have how it would have played out without these threats from the administration, but essentially saying, look, don't agree to this. If you vote for it, you could be in line for tariffs and port duties and maybe even travel restrictions and things. I mean, is there a worry that we have a Trump administration, a U.S. administration that doesn't want to come to the party, but wants to influence what's happening inside those four walls?
There's definitely a negative perception of U.S. actions, both in terms of climate and broader trade dynamics, and acknowledgement that Trump may seek to further erode collective climate action, which he is threatening to do. Under Trump, the perception of the U.S. as a climate partner has really degraded from unreliable, as I kind of noted earlier, to more obstructionist. A key example being threats to withdraw from the foundational 1992 UN framework, UNFCCC, which would remove the U.S. entirely from the core global climate negotiating system. And this would deeply undermine coordinated action. So far, those are only threats, perhaps some political positioning, but that threat of action is definitely viewed negatively.
Trump's kind of pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, but not out of that foundational UNFCCC. To do that is even a more drastic step. Trump's done a lot of things unilaterally. Is that something he can do?
The U.S. Senate is required to ratify treaties. Senate involvement in terminating ratified treaties, though, is not mandated or even mentioned in the Constitution. So various historical precedents exist of presidents acting unilaterally, such as President Carter terminating the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan, which was part of recognizing the People's Republic of China. President Bush withdrawing from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty with Russia, despite congressional objections. And then President Trump himself in 2019 withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the optional protocol of the Vienna Convention, and even threatened to withdraw from NATO before Congress enacted restrictions in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. So yes, there is a real risk that he could pursue this type of action unilaterally. Consequences be damned, although no official actions to this effect have materialized as of today.
There's been a lot of time spent and ink spilled on this climate pragmatism trend, and it's certainly something that you brought up as a key feature of the COP30 meeting in Belém. And so, how do you see that emphasis playing out in terms of what actually gets delivered from this 2-week conference?
The climate pragmatism really goes hand in hand with the broader implementation theme of COP30. And what we're really talking about here is a shift away from these lofty global climate pledges towards actionable, realistic, and scalable solutions. Things that could be done today by governments and businesses, even amid economic and political turmoil. So at COP30, we see this playing out in several different ways, focusing on delivery of past commitments over new pledges, alignment of climate goals with broader economic development and resilience strategies, localization of climate action to match the different realities on the ground in each country, and transparent achievement of incremental progress. So COP30 is about taking realistic steps forward, with leaders pushing to operationalize and finance existing commitments in specific and measurable ways. Our host, Brazil, is a good example. So Brazil's presidency has made strengthening multilateral cooperation, economic growth tied to climate progress, and implementation of existing NDCs central priorities. This is a departure from previous COPs focused on perhaps negotiating new targets. So nations are working at scaling renewable energy capacity and tracking redirection of fossil fuel investments, improving adaptation to the financing mechanisms. And in keeping with this pragmatism theme, there's an emphasis on the concrete, measurable, and achievable, such as deployment of proven technologies, practical transition plans, detailed sector-by-sector emissions reduction strategies. These are all great data points to inform progress, and definitely information we here at Rystad Energy will be following closely.
What does a successful outcome in Belém look like?
If we look at the trajectory of previous COPs, they've involved increasing definition around ambition. What do we intend to do? What do we need to do? How does this translate into objectives and goals and strategies? But COP30 aims to turn those ambitions into reality. So with delegations representing, I think, 194 of the countries, of the 198 countries, plus the EU, success is really about confidently transitioning from plans to action. So we'll be watching for a few KPIs, key performance indicators, to gauge success here. One will be mapping out achievable commitments via robust NDCs, nationally determined contributions. Two is operationalizing climate promises via adoption of the Belém action mechanism. Three is strengthening global cooperation on adaptation and nature-based solutions. Four would be scaling action through the launch of and capitalization of major new climate funds, such as the $25 billion Tropical Forests Forever facility and the Baku to Belém roadmap, aiming to achieve $1.3 trillion in annual public and private climate finance by 2035. Baku being where the prior COP29 was located. And then five here would be enabling transparent progress via concrete indicators and accountability frameworks. And then the last one is really this tripling of climate finance support for developing countries from 100 billion to 300 billion per year by 2030. So I think if we watch all of those, there's going to be different levels of success that can be attributed to each of them by each of the different member countries. And so we'll be tracking that, and maybe we can come on a future podcast and discuss how those are being measured and achieved.
We can see how things go. I mean, certainly some of those are very sticky issues when it comes to finance. The developing world has been asking the developed world, the OECD countries in particular, to put their money where their mouth is for many years now. And we've certainly seen some steps towards that, but I'll be really interested to see how the dynamic at Belém perhaps allows some of these initiatives to move forward. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us and unpacking all of these kind of interesting dynamics and frameworks surrounding the discussions. Have a safe trip to Belém.
Thank you, Noah.
I think that's a perfect segue to talk about how this newfound climate pragmatism could play out in perhaps one of the most pragmatic approaches to emissions reduction that will be discussed at the conference, and that's carbon markets. Regulated markets for carbon offsets have been one of the trickiest aspects of the Paris Agreement to implement. And though we saw a breakthrough last year at the COP29 meeting in Baku, much work remains to develop a system that both oil executives and environmentalists alike say is needed to direct capital into nature-rich but cash-poor countries. Petter, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Noah. Thank you.
You're Rystad Energy's leading expert on carbon markets, which is a huge focus of COP29 and are once again in the spotlight in Belém. But let's just take a quick step back here and understand. I want to start with, what are carbon markets in the first place, and why are they important for decarbonization?
Carbon markets are really a market-based approach to decarbonization. So we have on the other side sort of command and control policies, but market-based approach, we usually talk about carbon markets. And I like to separate carbon markets into two distinct markets. So on one hand, we have the voluntary carbon market, in which you have carbon projects that either reduce, avoid, or remove CO2. And 1 ton of CO2 removed, avoided, or reduced equals 1 carbon credit. And corporations can sell and buy however they want, usually related to their net zero commitments. And then on the other hand, you have compliance markets. And so compliance markets are essentially where jurisdiction governments, force sectors, companies to only emit X amount of tons of CO2 within a given year. And so I would say those are sort of the two ways to think about carbon markets. And they've gained a lot of popularity in recent years. We're seeing now for compliance markets, we have around 28% of global emissions is covered by some sort of carbon pricing system, either a carbon tax or a carbon market. And it's becoming increasingly popular because it's very technology agnostic. It doesn't, there's no government that says, okay, we're going to pick and choose this and that technology. It just sets the carbon price and then it lets the market decide which solution is the most effective. And then in terms of the voluntary carbon market, we're seeing an increasing interest because corporations, they want to reach their targets, but they want to do that in a cost-effective and time-efficient way. And so enter carbon credit markets.
I mentioned COP29 and as being pivotal for carbon markets. Just give us a quick rundown of what was actually decided there.
We've been trying to establish a carbon market mechanism under the Paris Agreement since it was signed in 2015. And we haven't really been able to do it until last year. So it's been a very politically contentious process. There's a lot of different parties that have a lot of different interests in how this market is being shaped and how it should be used. But finally, last year, we essentially agreed on the framework under which the market should function. So we agreed on the overarching standards that should define the projects that should be eligible to be traded in the market. In addition to the standards, we also established the infrastructure that is necessary to be able to trade credits and account for them properly in respective countries' climate reporting. We're not there yet. There's still ways to go. We still need to, the devil is going to be in the details. I know that's a cliche statement, but we really
but
need
true
to.
Oftentimes.
Right, exactly. So we need to define okay, we have the overarching standards, but how are we going to think about specific quality metrics like permanence? How long the CO2 should be stored, additionality. Does the project need the money that it generates to be able to make it feasible, right? So there are all these different details that we still need to iron out. And again, I go back to this point that it's a very political process. All these different countries that are part of the conversations have different interests. So right now we're really focusing on that.
How have markets, how have countries responded since COP29? What's happened in that year in terms of the development leading up to these discussions that are going to be happening in Belém?
There are a lot of things happening, both in terms of corporations, but also for countries. I think we can start with countries and say that, we've done a job in terms of seeing all the new NDCs that have come in before COP30. And essentially, what we've seen is that over 80% of new national determined contributions, basically respective countries' climate strategy plans, have some sort of way of incorporating Article 6. That's already a big deal, right? They want, in some way, they want to either use credits to meet their targets, or they want to generate credits to be able to receive that climate finance that they might not get in another way. And so that's one thing. And then in terms of corporations, you're seeing a lot of fuzz around developers. They're recognizing that this could become a very lucrative market. They're currently playing around in the voluntary carbon market, and so they're looking to Article 6 as a potentially good option to also sell their credits. So they're trying to figure out, okay, what are the new standards going to be? How can we potentially play in that market as well?
What are experts like yourself looking for out of COP30? What needs to happen to further enable this trading framework that you talked about being set up last year? And then I guess the follow-on question to that is what do you think will happen, perhaps based on the political realities of the negotiations that we've been talking about?
I think the focus for COP30 is implementation, like it seems to be for other topics as well. We need to figure out how this market is going to look like in practice. And I go back to the point that I made previously, which is we need to hammer out the details of the different standards that should underpin this market. And so that's where we're really paying a lot of attention. We're looking what are the different priorities across different countries. We're really focusing on implementation for COP30.
U.S. companies, I mean, particularly tech giants, the Metas, the Googles, the Microsofts, have been far and away some of the largest buyers of voluntary credits. And certainly, if they're going to be keeping to their decarbonization goals at the same time as growing these massive AI operations, credits are going to have to play a major role in that. And so, does the lack of a U.S. presence here matter to these discussions? And I guess a follow-on to that would be, how does the setting influence the discussions? I mean, Brazil is a major player in generating carbon credits, as certainly a lot of other countries are, particularly in the tropical developing world, those countries that have large forests.
In terms of these tech giants that you're seeing swooping up all these carbon credits coming from various projects, they're still going to be active in the voluntary carbon market, regardless of the U.S. federal government's position on the Paris Agreement. So their involvement, Microsoft, Google, for instance, they're still going to be buying carbon credits because it's mostly related to their net zero targets, right? But on the other hand, I think the US is also a huge source of carbon credit generation within the voluntary carbon market. You have a lot of technology based credits that are originating from standards or registries, such as the American Carbon Registry, such as the Climate Action Reserve. And so these project developers, they would ideally be able to participate in Article 6 markets, but with the United States currently not part of the Paris Agreement, they will have a difficult time having the administrative infrastructure to participate. And this is where it gets a little bit technical and complicated, but essentially the UN has a requirement to be able to participate that the host country of the project essentially controls for the fact that the credits are not being counted twice. So you have something called a corresponding adjustment. which is really a UN mechanism, and is something that currently the US hasn't really prepared for, as it's not planning on participating in these markets. So having said that, the implication in terms of the US not being a part of that conversation is that they would have a difficult time being part of that
I mean,
market.
it's pretty consequential. I mean, essentially, if you're not at the party, you don't get to be part of this market,
Right.
which is, as you said, separate from the voluntary market. So they could still participate voluntarily, but it essentially would wall off these projects from being able to be sold under this regulated Article 6 market.
Exactly. Yeah. Your second question on Brazil and the fact that this is taking place there, I think it is an important indicator of how nature based projects could be a part of the pool of credits that will be available under Article 6 carbon credit trading. Because Brazil is a major source of nature based or forestry related credits. And so we'll likely see a lot of focus on that. And nature based credits have gotten a bad rep, so to speak, in this market over the last few years, because they've been challenged on being able to correctly quantify the emission reductions that comes from their projects, and also struggling with other quality metrics such as leakage, right? And so I think nature based might come back into the conversation here. They're going to make a little bit of a comeback. I think there's a realization now that we certainly need nature based, albeit not as strong as perhaps a technology based project like direct air capture, which has a much stronger quality score in terms of permanence. Nature based could score pretty high when it comes to biodiversity, right? In terms of helping biodiversity in that area, in terms of helping local communities. So it's a give and take. It's a portfolio approach that we need to be going for here, and I think that's going to become an increasingly big part of the conversation at COP30.
We talked a little bit about U.S. companies. We talked a little bit about how companies have participated in voluntary markets up to this point. But I mean, generally, give me a snapshot of what the carbon credit market looks like right now, and then let's talk a little bit about where it might be going following these Article 6 discussions. How are things how are things shaping up in carbon markets, and how have they shaped up over the last year?
We have the voluntary carbon market. We have compliance markets, and then we have Article 6. And so there's a lot of fragmentation, because on the compliance markets you have these jurisdictional markets in which they govern things based on how they want their markets to be, and that's happening. Brazil has their own way, China has their own way, India, Japan, etc., and then Europe, of course, as well. And then the voluntary carbon market is global, and they're developing standards coming from initiatives that are inherently voluntary as well. But what we're spending a lot of time focusing on now, and this is a very hot topic, and you'll hear a lot of people in this carbon community space talking about this, it's the convergence between those markets. What we're seeing now is we've seen just a flurry of new compliance markets popping up over the last couple of years. A lot of that in APAC, but also in South America as well. And you can talk about the reasons for that. Maybe the government sees carbon markets as a more flexible decarbonization tool, or it could be a response to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, right, under the EU. Regardless, you're seeing more and more jurisdictions establishing carbon markets, and as a part of those carbon markets, they're allowing for carbon credits to be used. And so you have around 15 different compliance markets that allow for carbon credits to be used. Now, that means that, some are only saying, oh, we're just going to use carbon credits, generated domestically, but some are saying we're going to use those that are developed internationally through those voluntary initiatives. So we're going to source credits from the same projects that are active in the voluntary carbon market. And so the point here is that different jurisdictions have their way of defining high quality of a credit. In the VCM, some have it different for their compliance market, but we're seeing a convergence around those standards. And I think we'll continue to see that. And where Article 6 comes in, and COP30 and COP in general, is that it could be a perfect forum for different stakeholders to come together, agree on a standard, go back to their respective jurisdiction, implement policies, laws, regulation that enforces that, So if you're a carbon credit developer, if you're generating a credit, it's a fungible, tradable commodity, and you can use it in whichever market you want to play in, which means that you basically have a much huger source of financing when you want to get some sort of climate mitigation project up and running.
Can Article 6 live up to the promise? Where does this kind of leave us in terms of regulated or an Article 6 market versus a voluntary market? Does Article 6 matter?
You can go back to the Kyoto Protocol, right? And the clean development mechanism, which is kind of the precursor to this Article 6 mechanism, right? You had this attempt at creating a carbon market that could be a much more flexible, sort of a new way of allocating climate finance. But for a lot of people, it failed to deliver real results because a lot of the projects, fail to withstand criticism and deep dive checks in terms of quality assurance. And so Article 6 is our chance to come back and say that, and come up with new technologies, new strategies to ensure that the market, the foundation of the market, which is really quality, the quality of the projects, the quality of the credits, are as sound as possible. So that's going to be an incredibly important part. But we also have to recognize, and I'm going to use a cliche phrase here, we can't let the perfect get in the way of the good. You're not going to have carbon credits that are going to be traded in this market that are going to score equally on all these different quality metrics, be it permanence, additionality, quantification of the emissions reductions, and also sustainable development goals. I think the approach that we need to do is create a portfolio where you mix and match the different type of credits that you need to be able to have a robust portfolio of emission reduction contributions. So I think that's important. We need to get better at what we did, previous to what we did under the clean development mechanism, but we can't expect perfection, right? Especially considering the tight timeline that we're on. If we want to reach, climate targets within the timeline that we've set, 2050, we need to act now. And then let's try to work with the technology. Let's try to work with the new methodologies to make sure that they're keeping up with what's the best standard. And then I'd also say we have to do some work on carbon accounting, right? Which is not necessarily the most flashy subject, right? It's kind of, it could get boring, at least for some people, but it's a very important part of the conversation. Like, how do you account for the carbon reductions that you're using, especially if you're going to trade emission reduction across countries, across companies? That's a hugely important part. But you're seeing a lot of different initiatives. You're seeing coalitions of different companies in the private sector. They're trying to do stuff in this regard. You're seeing different jurisdictions. The EU is setting up regulation related to this, right? So we're seeing a lot of positive movements. I think Article 6 will have an important role. And I mean, just look at the EU. I mean, they're certainly banking on this, right? I think at the time of this conversation, we just got news that the EU has officially approved this idea of allowing member states to meet 5% of 1990 emissions with Article 6 credits. And they've explicitly said that we're going to use, or we're going to rely on, the standards developed under Article 6 methodologies, right? And this is hugely important because this is a 180-degree turn in position based on what they did previously, because they used to use these CDM credits, right? And then they turned their back on using carbon credits once a lot of those credits were proven to not deliver as promised. So we're certainly seeing a lot of companies and countries betting heavily on this. So I think we just have to make it work.
We'll certainly be watching whether COP30 and all the negotiations and discussions around there can build on the momentum from COP29 and what that ultimately means for Article 6 credits and carbon markets in general. Thank you, Petter, for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Noah.
Let's recap. COP30 is a pivotal meeting to help understand how the push for climate pragmatism and the accelerating shift towards a more multipolar world will impact both emissions and the global energy system. Carbon markets saw a historic breakthrough at COP29, but have struggled to develop in the year since, and buyers and sellers will look to COP30 discussions for further clarity. Whether in carbon markets or other areas of focus such as climate finance and funding for adaptation to a warming world, an intense focus on implementation at COP30 means we're more likely to see progress made on existing initiatives than announcements of new, but perhaps more aspirational, accords. Well, thanks for listening to Let's Talk Energy. This podcast is a production of Rystad Energy, produced by Laura Rodriguez Skaug and Både. Check out the show notes for further analysis of the topics we've discussed today, and connect with us on social media. We're at Rystad Energy on all your major platforms. While you're there, click the like button, leave us a review, and subscribe. You can also keep up to date with us on our website. If you'd like to send us a question, or perhaps you've got a suggestion for another episode, go ahead and email us directly. It's podcast@rystadenergy.com. And most importantly, don't forget to join us next week for more Let's Talk Energy.